evening, everyone. I have the pleasure to welcome you in our virtual event on delivering results via building energy performance standards. My name is Katarzyna Wardal. I am a convener of the Energy and Climate Committee at the European Insulation Manufacturers Association, EURIMA, and EU Public Affairs Manager at KNAUF Insulation. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our fantastic speakers today, who are without doubt experts in the field of energy efficiency of buildings. So I would like to start by introducing Mrs. Paula Rey Garcia. Paula is Deputy Head of Unit for Energy Efficiency of Buildings and Products in DG Energy at the European Commission, overseeing the Renovation Wave initiative. Paula, thank you very much for having accepted the invitation and for joining us today. And we know that you and your team are very busy working now on the Renovation Wave, and I hope that the discussion today will be a timely contribution to your work. Well, hello. And I'm also very happy that we have today with us Mrs. Pernille Weiss. Pernille is a member of the European Parliament from Denmark, member of the European People's Party. She holds a seat in the Industry, Research and Energy Committee and the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. Recently, Mrs. Weiss was a shadow rapporteur on an own initiative report on maximizing the energy efficiency potential of the EU building stock. And this report called on the European Commission to develop a legislative framework for the introduction of the minimum performance standards for buildings, for existing buildings, that are progressively tightened over time in line with the 2050 objective. So our next speaker is a representative of a financial sector, Mr. Tjeerd Krumpelman, who is the Global Head of Advisory, Reporting and Engagement at ABN AMRO. He heads up a team that offers advice on sustainability and is responsible for integrated thinking and reporting. Welcome, Tjeerd. And our fourth speaker, Mrs. Louise Sunderland, who will introduce the topic of the Building Energy Performance Standards today, is Senior Advisor at the Regulatory Assistance Project. Her expertise covers energy efficiency in the existing building stock and energy and sustainability standards in new buildings and places. So now I would like to encourage the audience to send your questions over the chat function throughout the webinar, and my colleague Bastian will make sure that the most inspiring ones are asked to the panel. So now, Louise, before we go into details, perhaps you could start explaining the concept of the building energy performance standards and what experience do we already have with them so far in Europe and across the world. And by the way, it seems that there are different abbreviations used. Minimum energy performance standards, building energy performance standards. Maybe you could clarify, is there any difference? Is it the same? So the floor is yours, Louise. Thank you.
Thanks, Kazia, and thanks for having me. So yeah, just to give minimum energy performance standards or building energy performance standards in a nutshell, they are regulations that require existing buildings, and that can be the whole existing stock or sectors within it, to meet a specific standard at a trigger point or point in time. So just to give one example to clarify what that means, in the Netherlands, there is a standard that applies to office buildings, requires them to meet the energy label C standard by 2023. So that's the three kind of component parts of a minimum energy performance standards or building energy performance standards. And just to clarify, this structure allows this one policy to drive both the rate and the depth of renovation, which we obviously know are the two important factors. So through setting a date for compliance or a trigger point in the building's life cycle, maybe it's the sale of the building or the rent of the building, we're driving the rate of renovation. So we're driving buildings to be renovated. And then obviously the standard that we are requiring those buildings to meet at that point drives the depth, the ambition of the renovation. And these are a really interesting family of policies. And they are increasing in their use worldwide. And as you say, Kazia, this is kind of where we get all this, these different names from. We have building energy performance standards, or building performance standards is the term favored in the US. in the UK that brought in these standards quite a long time ago. They're called MEES, Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards. And there are, as you said, Kazia, a number of different terms, but they all apply to this same family of policies. And some of the names are I think, just indicate differences in the way that these policies are designed. But broadly, we're talking about the same thing. So in Europe, we have these policies in place in a number of member states, in France, Netherlands, Belgium, England and Wales, and separately in Scotland. And then beyond Europe, as I said, there's been a really interesting flurry of interest and development of these policies in states and cities in the US, and in particularly in Australia and New Zealand. And if I can just take a moment, what's really interesting, I think, about these worldwide examples is that they're driven by local priorities, and the design of the regulation is then responsive to those local priorities. So, for example, in the United States, the introduction of building performance standards has been very much driven by stretching carbon targets on cities or states. And so their standards have targeted the most polluting buildings, the biggest buildings with the biggest carbon emissions. Whereas in Australia and New Zealand, in the countries of Great Britain and in Flanders, the introduction of the standards has been much more driven by a concern about housing standards and the impact of housing on health, well-being and energy poverty. And we have a broad range of standards across Europe that illustrate that these standards can be used in different sectors with different targets and different metrics used. So I suppose in summary, MEPs are a sort of a flexible policy that can be used in response to different local priorities, but to drive both the rate and the depth of renovation.
So this is actually the reason why we have them, to drive the depth and rate of renovation. Are there any other reasons why they are so popular already, getting traction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not going to be news to anyone when I say that, we're still struggling with driving renovation at scale in Europe. It is the kind of massive challenge. I mean, I work in buildings, so I would say it's one of the biggest challenges, but I think that is a common term, commonly held view. At the moment we hear that we are needing to double or triple our renovation rate from the current 1% to 3%. But I actually think the 1% renovation rate that we keep referring to is an overstatement, because when we look at the energy savings achieved in a lot of those renovations that make up that 1%, they're not achieving very much. They're not very deep. They're not achieving very much energy savings at all. And when we look at deeper renovations, they're only happening around 0.2 to 0.3 of the floor area each year. So, when we talk about doubling or tripling the rate of renovation, unless we address this depth of renovation, we should be talking about maybe increasing the rate of renovation by 10 or 15 times. So this is why this kind of dual balance of rate and depth is super important. And just to say, it has been a long-term struggle. My whole career, and I'm sure people who have been working in buildings for much longer, has been spent really talking about this same issue. And unfortunately, the current measures we have in place are just not enough. They are not doing the job we need to. In the countries we see where there are well-designed renovation programs with lots of practical support and some finance in place, we aren't seeing the renovation rate significantly increase in those countries. And we're also hearing that as we make more money available for renovation, it's struggling to be spent. So I think it's absolutely time, in fact, long overdue, that we look for these stronger drivers to create the demand alongside providing this extra finance and more money for renovations. And I suppose just to say, well, we all know that challenge. I've just spent, probably too long explaining the challenge that everyone understands. So why MEPs? Why this particular policy? Well, it's interesting because when I started the research for the report that RAP published earlier this year, a colleague helping me frame the report said, should we not set this one policy in amongst the context of the other alternatives that we have, that we should be balancing? And he said to me, what are the alternatives? And I had no answer. There was no alternative that I could think of. And so, having had no answer, I then, throughout my research, asked that question of other people, and having subsequently published the report, I continue to ask that question. And really, I haven't heard a good answer as an alternative to MEPs. I've heard a lot of really useful complementary policies. So the big one for me is the area-based approaches that really, I think, complement the use of MEPS, but nothing that does the same job in the way that we need it to. So yeah, I have come to the conclusion that if we are really serious about doubling or tripling the renovation rate as part of the renovation wave in Europe, we really need to seriously be looking at these policies.
So Louise, tell us more about the RAP report that you mentioned. What does it bring to the discussion in the context of the renovation wave, concretely?
Well, I think just from my point of view, I mean, I'm from the UK, and in the UK we brought in minimum energy efficiency standards, as we call them there, you know, a long time ago. So this is a policy area that I've been thinking about, you know, for a large part of my career. But what I was really surprised at when I came to do this more in-depth research is really that we have more examples out there than I was expecting to find, which also means we have, you know, more experience on how to design these policies than I was previously expecting. And we're also finding that we're now seeing some evidence of the impact as, you know, as these policies mature, come to enforcement, we're starting to see a lot more evidence of impact. So I think the first point to take from the report and from the research is that I think we should have more confidence now than at any time in the past to move forward at European level, because we do have this growing body of experience and learning to draw from. And just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things we learned, is that often thought of as an enforcement tool, a regulation is often thought of as an enforcement tool. We actually found MEPS were providing a really clear signal in the market in some of the countries they've been introduced in, even before their enforcement. So, you know, the time between announcement and enforcement was very effective to drive demand and also align the supply chain. So align finance providers, the renovation supply chain, in expectation of this, you know, flow of renovation. And I think we're certainly seeing that in the Netherlands, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit more from later in the webinar on that example in the Netherlands. I think also MEPS can articulate the role and the responsibility for every individual building and what their role and responsibility is in this kind of larger, you know, national or European route map to decarbonisation. I think it's a really important and powerful sort of communication tool there. But both of those two things can only be achieved when the policy is announced with a good lead time to allow those things to align before enforcement. So we saw really between 4 and 10 years between the policy being announced and the enforcement. So it's quite, you know, it's quite a long-term planning process for these policies. But obviously, once again, you know, if we know that that's the power of these policies, we really need to think about introducing them, announcing them now. And just to say, I suppose then they not only provide this long-term early signal, but they do provide the regulatory backstop that I mentioned. So they're important to ensure that the worst performing buildings don't get left behind. And this is really important, obviously, when we're thinking about homes and we're thinking about the need to ensure that our homes don't adversely affect health and well-being, and that our homes can be part of the solution to energy poverty, rather than as they are at the moment, some of the worst performing homes really exacerbating and driving families in Europe into energy poverty. And I suppose just the last thing I would say about the report, well, is go and read it, but also we did conclude that a legislative approach is needed now, and we reviewed the existing provisions that sit in this kind of MEPS family in the European directives. So we established, I think, that there is a precedent for this way of thinking and this way of doing at European level, and we've also outlined some of the opportunities that we have to significantly strengthen some of that existing legislation and add to it as well. As I say, we've outlined a number of ways in which we think this can be done, but obviously lots more work to be done there. You know, and this webinar, I'm sure, will contribute hugely.
Super. Thank you very much for this great introduction, Louisa. I would like to now ask our other speakers for their reactions, starting with Paula, maybe. Paula, considering these takeaways of the RAP report that Louise just presented, what do you think about standards as a policy tool in the context of renovation?
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate today. I am very happy to be part of this discussion because it's a very important topic and very relevant, in fact, in the context of the renovation wave. The elements that Luis was mentioning about increasing the performance and the quality of the building stock in Europe is definitely not a new area. But over the last years, what has been particularly the focus from a regulatory perspective has been the performance of new buildings. And here it's true that we have seen the results, and that thanks to EU policy, but also to action at national level, new buildings today, they are really much more performing than before. But we know that the problem is really the existing stock, which is old, is inefficient, responsible for approximately 40% of the energy use in Europe, and is also not very sustainable. So there is also room for improvement from a circular economy principles perspective. No? But the increase of the renovation rate and of the depth is really a difficult nut to crack. And we see that there are multiple barriers. So in this regard, we definitely can see the important advantages of energy performance standards for increasing the rate and the depth of renovation. And I would like to give also quite concrete examples, because in the preparation of the renovation wave, what we have done is to really do an updated analysis of the barriers that renovation is facing. And we see that in this regard, performance standards for buildings and renovation requirements, they can really be very impactful in practice to shift poorly performing buildings towards better performance by increasing the rate and increasing the depth of renovation. It's also very important for us that they can have a very strong link to energy performance certificates. And this connects them to citizens and to businesses because it gives information. So putting also the certification of the building as one of the points of departure is something that can be very positive for engaging, in the end, people living in buildings, using buildings, working in buildings, into this route towards more performing ones. What we can also see is that, in fact, they can also tackle very specifically some of the most important market barriers and information barriers hampering building renovation. So, for instance, they can really be effective in tackling very persistent obstacles in the area, such as split incentives between owners and tenants, and also low awareness, because they, again, bring the certification of the building, the quality of the building, to the attention of the specific sector that they would be tackling, because we have also been looking with interest at experience gain in member states across Europe, and we see that they can be designed in very different ways, and they can tackle very different building segments or building sectors. And then as another important advantage that we see is that, in fact, you are directly creating an enhanced market for building renovation. And this can give a direct boost to the construction and the renovation industries. So there are a number of very important advantages. But we also would like to keep in mind that they also bring some elements of caution. Because in particular, they can have, they normally do quite important capital needs involved, and therefore they need to be designed in a careful manner, because they can raise really affordability questions in some cases. And then they also require a very deep knowledge of the building stock, and this is not always available. And without that deep knowledge, they cannot really be well designed and well adjusted to local and national conditions. So having all this in mind, that the very important and very impactful advantages that they can have, but also these elements of caution, what we would see is that this is really very important, that because energy performance standards are very flexible in their design, that this flexibility is maximized to really adapt their introduction, to really see what are the building segments to be targeted as a priority in each context, but also with an adequate enabling framework of supportive accompanying measures. For instance, financial support or tax incentives. And this, in fact, we have seen, we have followed, of course, with lots of interest, the work of the European Parliament, and we see that this is an element that comes up, there. And we also have seen this combination of lots of interest in this tool, but also an element of caution in the open public consultation that we have run over the last months, where similar messages were echoed by really a majority of respondents, really raising this as one of the most important measures to increase building renovation, but also mentioning this element of caution that I was indicating.
Thank you, Paula. So you raised the European Parliament's report, so probably it's the perfect moment to give the floor to Pernille. Pernille, as a shadow rapporteur, you've put forward an amendment supporting the legislative options to be introduced in the renovation wave. What do you see as the main benefits and opportunities of these standards?
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. This because my screen is freezing once in a while, just to let you know.
But
okay,
we can see you and we can hear you very well.
Thank you. And thank you for taking this initiative, and also thank you for a very, very interesting introduction from you, Louise. I look forward to read your work and report in the aftermath of this morning. But to be brief and to answer the question, of course, in the European Parliament, in the framework of the European Green Deal, which is a little bit in the risk of being left behind because of the Corona situation, it is so important for me that we have this morning, but also that this initiative report where we had a very big compromise in between the political groups. We had a very solid foundation now with a bouquet of ideas for the Commission and hope for the Commission's proposal for the way the renovation wave will be designed and opened up in also its details and action plans. Because what is so important is that we see the combination between the climate change and the recovery in Corona, but also see that we can create more jobs, we can create more healthy buildings, more social communities, we can engage the SMEs, and first and foremost also we can engage with these standards also to have a more evidence-based language about when we have a building stock. And that was very important for us in the negotiation team. When we have building stock, how can we enable the building owner and other around the building to really do the analysis that comes up with a solid plan for either a deep renovation or a staged deep renovation or stage renovation, also in respect to the typologies. So we need more evidence, and that's also where the digital change, the digital transformation in Europe is a third pillar to what we can actually do from focusing on the renovation wave and really to unfold it, because we need more smart technologies to be introduced in the way we work with the building renovation. And that's also a part of what we agreed on in the opinion to push forward. That before the coronavirus, we had the climate change and the digital change as the two most important topics for the parliament. But now in the framework of the corona, we see that we can actually heal our economies, because 1 million euros spent in energy renovation in the existing building stock actually creates 18 jobs, and we need those jobs. And also we need this engagement in how to see your physical surroundings as a part of making Europe more resilient, to make us more robust, because we might see a future where we need to use our homes and the places where we work in a different way to enable us to be cautious and not to get sick because of some kind of a virus. So we have here a potential Bermuda triangle, digital, climate, and a virus, a pandemic. But I really see the opinion that we agreed and we are going to send over to the Commission and also the Parliament's expectations to the renovation waves, that we do know what to do, but we need to put all the technologies together. And as the last thing I will say in this part of the agenda is that for me personally, I come from a little country that has maybe more easy to do with the green transition. I admit that, being a Dane, but also being a former consultant and analyst in the building sector. But I do think that I would hope for my colleagues in the Parliament and also in the national parliaments to introduce energy efficiency measures in the economic agreements that we do with each other. I was a little bit disappointed, to be honest, that I come from a country that is called Frugal 4, that we didn't use our veto right to actually put forward measures for energy renovation, both in the MFF, more specifically, but exactly in the recovery package. Because we can recover by doing our homes and our buildings more climate friendly, but also more healthy. I think that's very important to push that up and also to raise the awareness of my colleagues, because to be honest, it is still a little bit buildings and energy efficiency. It's not sometimes that sexy in the plenary, just to be honest. And I would really like us also to help each other to give them the urge to see the possibilities for both more social, more healthy, and more climate friendly homes and buildings for a resilient Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Pernille. So speaking of attractiveness of building energy renovation, I will now give the floor to Tjeerd, who represents the financial sector. So perhaps he can tell us that actually building renovation is interesting for some sectors, some market actors. And Louise mentioned earlier the importance of giving the signal to the market. And also Paula mentioned accompanying measures. So I'm quite confident that Tjeerd can shed some light on these aspects. Having in mind the Netherlands, Louise mentioned before, which is a good country probably to look at and its policies in that field. So in the Netherlands, the label C requirement for offices was announced in 2012. Louise, maybe, and Tjeerd, you can complement later on, you know better than me. And that was done as a part of the covenant between the government and the sector. Evidence shows that since then, there has been very large growth of office buildings with an energy label A to C. And in social rental buildings, so a different sector of buildings, a proposal from the government to prepare a legal obligation for the whole sector already resulted in having the sector responded with plans to reach the goals in 2021. So it seems that these measures are able to give the right signal to act. So Tjeerd, could you maybe tell us, has this Dutch policy created opportunities in the finance sector? And what are these opportunities for you from the financial sector perspective?
Yes, I'll try. And good morning, everybody. And thanks for having me here as well. And great to give a little bit of the Dutch and specifically the finance perspective on the renovation wave. And as mentioned, these policy announcements are really a driver also for financial institutions. But first of all, they are a signal to the owners of these buildings. So the announcement for commercial real estate that it had to have a C label or better by 2023 in order to be allowed to rent it out on a commercial basis, that policy change, or it wasn't even a change, it was a policy announcement because it took a few years, but it really moved the market. So it moved the market in terms of the owners of these buildings. They wanted to start renovating because otherwise they would lose their income. but it also sent out a signal to the finance industry that it would become a risk for financials or for banks to have loans to buildings that are not equipped to this standard, or that will not meet this standard after 2023, because that real estate will become less valuable, will become more difficult to let out, or so actually that announcement moved both the owners but also the finance industry, including ABN AMRO, to set up policies and to set up financing opportunities and set up advisory units on how to support our clients in their transition to more sustainable finance. Now, this relates well to the ambitions that ABN AMRO has on being a more sustainable bank and to help our clients become more sustainable. So this policy aligns well with a lot of the practices and interests of banks. I want to add one more thing that you mentioned this as well. This is where I think it worked less well. Maybe it can in the future, but that was not followed up yet. Strict policies. It was kind of it's still in the kind of the free format announcement phase. So less. There have been some improvements in social housing, but they have been less fast than they were in commercial real estate, because commercial real estate has really picked up the pace. Banks have given the opportunity to finance it. So ABN AMRO has said any improvement on any building to get it above sea level in terms of energy, not in terms of the ocean, but sea level in terms of energy, because above sea level will be challenging in the Netherlands. Above sea level in terms of energy, we will finance it 100%. So all these improvements will get a financing. And this is how you avoid the kind of the catch-22, where owners want to renovate but don't get the financing for it. This was avoided in the Netherlands. I want to add one more argument or one more viewpoint on this. We are very much focused on the technical state of the building. So this energy efficiency is focused on the technical state. I would like to add that we also need the data and the information on the real usage, the real energy usage of buildings. And just by focusing on the technical state, we kind of overlook the human aspect of how to efficiently use a building in terms of energy, and how we can influence behavior and use that as a driver for less energy use in terms of buildings. I think that's one aspect that is often overlooked when we only look at the technical side of buildings. And finally, we can also look at energy sources, right? So if we have a less energy efficient building, but with a very sustainable energy source, then that could also help in solving the actual problem of the pollution or the carbon emitted from buildings, which is a large part responsible for the total energy consumption and the total carbon of a country, at least in most European countries. So by focusing on usage and on energy source and adding that to the whole debate of energy efficiency of buildings, I think we will be more effective.
Thank you, Triet. Thank you very much. So now I would like to turn to Bastian, and I would like to who could introduce some questions that we received from the audience. I see them coming. I'm sure, Bastian, you have picked the most inspiring by now.
Yes, thank you very much, and a very good morning. Indeed, a lot of questions coming up through the chat. Unfortunately, time does not allow us to put them all forward to the panel, but we have chosen a couple, and let's see how far we come with the time that is allotted to this. So the first question, Louise, is to you. It's from Reinis Albontinis, a researcher at the Riga Technical University. And he asks you specifically what, following up from your research and the REP report, What are the most effective combinations of policy instruments to boost the building renovation in household and residential sector? And he wonders specifically whether the success will depend on the proportion and the right sequence of hugs, carrots, and sticks.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. Beautifully put. So specifically in the residential sector, I think obviously the clear signal that we're talking about today, but the enabling framework that I think Paula mentioned is incredibly important in housing. And I think for me, the concept of the one-stop shop, so a service that allows the customer journey to really be very organized, very streamlined for the individual. Renovating a building, obviously, as we know, takes a lot of technical ability. It takes a lot of time and resources. And so, having these services, which I believe should be locally available, locally relevant, engaged and integrated with the local supply chain to deliver the renovation, is the absolute key. I think so. In addition to that very practical support, which can also then integrate in all the funding and finance that might be available for a household, I think in addition to that, we do need to do some wider work about aligning our incentives, so that the tax incentives that we have, the other pieces of the wider policy framework do align to really make the decision worthwhile and obvious for a householder before the regulation bites. I will just say the last word, of course, on low-income households and energy-poor households. It is, to me, an undeniable fact that we will need to massively subsidise, if not provide, free renovations for those who can't afford it. And that issue is something we need to have a long, hard look at, and look at what the levels of support through the one-stop shop approach that are needed by low-income and vulnerable households, which might be different to the rest of the population. So to provide specific levels of support, but also very high levels of funding and finance that's appropriate for low-income and vulnerable households.
Okay, thank you very much for that concrete answer to this question. Now for the public, I will address the second question to the panel, but in the meantime, I will open up a poll as well. So there is an interactive element within this webinar as well. I will open up a poll for you to vote on. And the question will be, what is in your opinion the most important role of building energy performance standards in delivering on the renovation wave? Because there's a couple of ways in which building energy performance standards can help drive the rate of renovation. And among them are, for example, signaling the finishing line, giving clarity to the wider public on what the ultimate goal is, ensuring that nobody is left behind, especially as well in relation to what Louise just said, in making sure that the people living in the worst performing buildings get the first benefits, removing obstacles to renovation in the fact that, of course, the current subsidy measures which are already there can be used in a more effective way because it's complemented by a policy framework, enabling timely action to provide information to homeowners to see on which moment they can best invest in their house or in their building, and enabling the enablers. That goes to what Chair just said as well. By signaling the finish line, you give a clear signal to the market, both the producers as the financial market, to develop new products and to start innovating. So I see you're already starting with the poll, so that's very nice. In the meantime, I would like to put a second question to the panel, and it's a question specifically to Paula and Pernil. And it's a question from Tristan Cephas, the Secretary General at Eurogypsum. And he actually asks, do you see a bigger appetite for building energy performance standards today from member states than in the past years? And he asks, are there reasons for hope we can make progress now? I think, Paula, you already touched upon it a little bit in your introduction, but maybe, Pernille, it's nice if you could add it from your political perspective as well. Paula, maybe first
Yeah.
we'll give the floor to you.
Thank you. Well, I would hope the appetite was bigger at this moment, and I honestly very much hope that the opinion and the message around the opinion coming from the Parliament, as well also in the introduction of the renovation wave, when the action plan is being introduced from the Commission side, that we will see a bigger appetite amongst my colleagues in national parliaments. Because when I talk with the industries, when I talk with the building owners, public or private, or what constellation they are in, they are so much intrigued actually to do, either by health or by social aspects or by climate aspects, to do renovation projects. So I really think we need the standards to be embraced, but I'm also a little puzzled because of the national plans to energy renovation. And that was actually a question that I can pass on to Paula. What can we do? What can you do as a commission? I think there's still, out of 27 countries, only 6 countries has delivered in. And also all the promises made strategically on the renovation rate to 3%, we are still performing below 1% average. I mean, I'm so sick and tired actually, as being a parliamentarian here in the European Parliament, listening to national parliaments and prime ministers promising to deliver, but actually not doing it in real life. So what can we do without going on the revolutionary road, which is not a part of my EPP heart to do so? So what are the still not found obstacles that we need to remove, not only the incentives in the market, but also in the political field? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pernille, for that strong statement as well. Paula, perhaps not entirely answerable, but maybe you could respond as well to what Pernille has put forward.
Yes, so on the question of whether there is more appetite for action on building energy performance standards, maybe to recall that in fact we had, at the time of the preparation of the clean energy package and in discussions with the Council and the Parliament, explored this option already, but it was not retained at the time. And at the time, the concerns were mostly related to the investments that were attached to it, the more limited experience at the time than the one that we have today, and also the question of lack of reliable data. But since that time, we see that the financial support for building renovation has increased, not only in size, but also in scope. We also see that both under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, but also in the next MFF, there will be very significant funds potentially available for member states, but they, of course, need to access those. And something very concrete that we would expect to see if member states really want to tackle building renovation is that they identify building renovation in the recovery plans. So we are really passing this message to member states, and that is something that would give us the signal also of the readiness at member state level to be serious about the building renovation. As regards the long-term renovation strategies, we really see them central to our efforts on the renovation wave, central also to the recovery plans, because they are really the plan for measures and investments in building renovation in the years to come, because not to forget that they have already a vision up to 2050 and up to decarbonization of the national building sector. But unfortunately, we have only received 12 of them. So it's not 6, but it's still not good enough, definitely, because the deadline was in March 2020. So we have been urging member states at every political level from our side, and we will keep doing so also in the context of the recovery discussions and in the renovation wave itself, because we really see it as a precondition, having a proper long-term renovation strategy for implementing the renovation wave and for accessing really in an effective manner the funding that will be available in the next multi-annual financial framework, where, for instance, having a long-term renovation strategy should normally be also a condition for accessing particular funds like regional funds, cohesion funds, but also as an essential precondition for implementing and deploying recovery funds into building renovation. So this is some of the elements that we see. So on the one hand, a more mature, definitely ground for exploring much more actively this potentially very impactful tool of building energy performance standards, but also the need for support and for action at member state level, including through the delivery of the pending long-term renovation strategies.
Okay,
Thank you
very much for that comprehensive answer. I would like to address now the poll results, because the voting is in, to put it in Eurovision terms. And actually, what we see in the results, thank you all very much for the voting. We see a very even divide between the answers. So it means that actually all the factors and roles are deemed important, but the front runner is indeed enabling timely action. So that is the communication towards the market and building owners, and enabling them to make the right decisions at the right time, because they know what the finish line will be. But as well, interestingly, the public says that removing obstacles to renovation is a very important role for BEPS to play. It's a very interesting result. Thank you very much. I think now this is time for us to go to the second part of the panel debate, and I will give the floor back.
Thank you, Bastian. Thank you. That was indeed very interesting. So now in this part, I would like to launch a discussion about the way forward and policy options. So in that context, yesterday, a broad coalition of stakeholders sent an open letter to Mr. Timmermans, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, on the importance of minimum energy performance standards for buildings to spur the renovation wave. This letter is available in the chat function, so everyone can read it. So I have some questions to Paula and Pernille. How can member states examples, what we heard from Luis, what we heard from Thiert,
It seems like my colleague is... Sorry, we lost you for a moment, so maybe you can repeat the question. No. Then I will take over. So the question my colleague was trying to ask, of course, was related to the open letter and to the introduction of BEPs into the political debate. Maybe Paula and Pernille, the first question I can ask to you: how can the member state examples, which we have discussed and which are in the rep report very well discussed as well, how can they be turned into a success on EU level? What is needed for it? I think you already touched a little bit upon it in your answers during the Q&A before this, but what do we need to turn member state successes into EU successes? And I see my colleague is back, so she will take over, but maybe Paula, you can start answering this question. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I think I mentioned some elements in the introductory part. I would think that really there are some key ingredients that we need to see happening for transferring this experience to the EU level. So one very important piece is really the flexibility element that I was mentioning at the very beginning, because these building energy performance standards, they can be very flexible in their design. So if you are to transfer them to the EU level, considering the couple of elements of concern that I raised at the beginning in terms of costs and data that is required, it is very important to tap on this flexibility. So that there is flexibility for member states to define and to have sufficient lead times to adapt their calendar for the introduction of these requirements, and also for the end result that they will put as an end target. They also need flexibility for really identifying the pioneer, let's say, building types and segments to be tackled first. And also to define the endpoint. So what is really the EPC class that is targeted and by when, and in which building segments first. And then it's very important, the elements that I was mentioning about an enabling framework, because we have really a lot of support now, potential available for building renovation, thanks to recovery, thanks to the next multi-annual financial framework, although it's of course going through the final mile of negotiations with Council and Parliament, but still the expectation is that there will be quite a lot of financial support for building renovation potentially available, and this really needs to be embedded in the design of these standards at EU level in a way that also allows member states to adjust them to their local and national conditions. So these are really very important elements, so that member states, for instance, have the supportive financial and tax measures at national level, and that they also have flexibility to have these elements introduced in their national legal frameworks in line with a number of EU-level requirements, but have also lots of flexibility to identify which building segment first and how.
Thank you very much, Paula. Can you hear me? Good. So I asked my question, and then I heard my colleague Bastian saying that I was gone. So I could hear you, but apparently you couldn't hear me. So thank you, Paula, but I heard everything what you said. So now I will ask the same question to Pernille, but in the meantime, I will also say something about the letter that was sent yesterday by the broad coalition of stakeholders to the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, on the importance on the minimum energy performance standards for buildings to spur the renovation wave. So in that context, I think that our conversation is very timely. So now, Pernille, from your perspective, how could these member states examples could be turned into success at the European level? And what's your reaction to Paula's proposal?
I'm very positive to Paula's proposal. I cannot add more to that, but I would add on top of that, from the opinion, the underlinement of the need of evidence-based approach that and smart technologies. That is where we can help each other to spread the news about how new technologies, how different projects, how did they do the analysis, the assessment of the building stock, how did they make the decision on financing and the balance between either deep renovation or stage deep or staged. How was the engagement of the owner, and it may be tenants, it may be families, or it can be businesses that are renters of the building. So we need knowledge to be put forward in a way that is easy to adapt and use in one-stop shops especially, but also to be used by the market, by the SMEs. That's very important for me to underline, that if the carpenters, the SMEs working with buildings, if they know also technologies plus financing sources and the organ of different finance sources, then they can contribute even more to help a client to get started in an energy renovation. A lot of people think it's a mountain too high to climb, because it's both a matter of choosing the right technology, the right process, and to knit together the patchwork of finance sourcing to see the business model actually to be sustainable. And that is where I would like to, just as the the last part of what I can add to what Paula already said is that in the opinion, there is this idea coming from the Parliament that we should have a kind of a climate calculator in Europe, which enables our industries to articulate very, very, I hope, easy as possible and also as relevant and as evident proof as possible. What is the CO2 reduction contribution that the technology can give? And also in a way that makes it more easy to do the analysis equation of a building stock and say, okay, hey, we use this technology on this stage. And then we assess what did we gain and what do we need for the next stage. Also, in order to invite innovation and changes in the future technologies that are not known to us right now, that we still keep us open towards new inventions, new technologies. Also to make the way that we work with our existing building stock in Europe as a showroom for the rest of the world, so that our industries also in the export can help CO2 reductions outside of the EU, because of the examples that we can put forward into and link our evidence bank and our one-stop shop library of good products examples, that we can use them in our export work as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Pernilla. This is absolutely inspiring. You're using existing buildings as a showroom for European technologies. I think it's really, really amazing. Tjeerd, what's your reaction to what we just discussed at the EU level, the building energy performance standards that could be introduced? How this could potentially create financing opportunities at the member states level in each country in Europe?
Yeah, well, it does create financing opportunities. This clarity to the market, these signals to the market, they do create signals to banks and to financial partners in a really large and extensive way. So any policy change, perhaps even included in the taxonomy and in TCFD kind of guidelines, that is really helpful to create investors, not only banks, but investors as well, to take the energy efficiency of buildings more into account when putting a price or a value on buildings. So, but more than they do nowadays. So these signals, I think the local signals from the member states, so from the countries, are even more powerful. But from an EU perspective, I would guess that to include energy efficiency in a strong way, for instance, in the taxonomy, in the green taxonomy, that would be powerful as well, because it allows for financing to take it into account. And we know that the value, there's been a lot of studies that the value of buildings over time increases if it becomes more energy efficient. We can do all the math, we can do the calculations, we know it's better on all capitals, on all indicators, but to enforce it or to encourage it by even the hint of future legislation, I think that would be a very powerful signal and would be helpful for both banks and investors, but also for owners of real estate to take this more into account. And I heard the 1% or the 3%. I would guess that if you give a clear signal to the market, then that is really supportive of that percentage as well.
Very clear answer. Thank you. So now it's time for the questions from the audience again. But
thank you very much. Yes, quite some questions coming up again. I have a question from Selina Carré, and I think maybe Tjeerd, you can come up here as well. Boosting financing support as part of recovery plan and kicking the building energy performance standards are two sides of the same coin. What can the Commission do to transform the momentum on renovation and recovery to the reality and to better to realize better buildings for all EU citizens?
Well, the commission, we can do a lot of things together, right? So I think to make it easier, to make it more accessible, but also to just set some clear guidelines. This is where we want buildings to be by this year, and give the market time, right? So this is not something that you can do in 1 year, but to set a clear goal for 2025 and for 2030. This is where we expect buildings to be, and if not, there will be there should be some kind of incentive, like the example that we used in the Netherlands. You're simply not allowed to rent out buildings or to let buildings on a commercial basis if it's not up to standard C. That was a really powerful message. For social housing, I really identify with the fact that not all homeowners are able to finance this or to fund this. But a lot of social housing is owned by governments or by social housing companies. We could facilitate them as well in renovating those properties much faster than all individual properties. So giving this clear sense of direction, it gives a direction to the market, but it also gives a direction to market participants. And I think that's the most powerful instrument. Taking into account what I said in my opening statement, keeping an eye on and a focus on the usage of building, real data on energy consumption, and having a clear focus on more renewable energy as well.
All right, I think that's a nice bridge as well to our next poll for the audience, because you as well mentioned that the building energy performance standards are not a standalone measure. They should be part of a bigger policy framework. So we would like to ask to the audience as well, what in your opinion is the most important part of the comprehensive framework that should accompany the introduction of building energy performance standards? Is it the public subsidies which should be available, especially for low-income households? Is it clear communication both before on consultation on the standards as after on where do the standards lead to and what do they require of the building owners? Is it that we need good and concrete building level information, for example, by an enhanced EPC or by a building passport? So if you want to know where you're going, you first need to know where you're standing right now. Is it advisory services and one-stop shops, so we make it as easy as possible for building owners to go forward with implementing the standards? Or is it as well a quality assurance and consumer protection, so as to give the broader public trust and confidence in the measures they are taking within their buildings? So I would very much like to invite you to vote on the poll. Then, in the meantime, I would like a second question to the panel before addressing the results. And it's a question from Jean-Arnold Vinois, and he asks, should commercial buildings be used as the first priority for building energy performance standards, given the need for flexibility expressed by Paula, that probably applies more to the residential buildings? So this is a question to which segment to focus on first with the building energy performance standards. Paula, maybe you could respond to this, because that might be an option, a policy option as well.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think this possibly goes back to the analysis that Luis has been carrying out and presenting, because at EU level, one of the main points is precisely the flexibility. So we can see, of course, a need for addressing worse performing buildings. That needs to be one of the focus areas for the renovation wave. We see also the need for addressing public buildings and social infrastructure. So, for instance, schools, hospitals and care facilities, public buildings as a priority, but the balance of tools to be used in each of these cases may differ, because as it was rightly mentioned, building energy performance standards and financial support, they come together. They are really different sides of the same coin. So depending on the segment and depending on the national circumstances, you may need to put the balance more on the one or on the other. And member states may need to address first a certain segment through a minimum energy performance standards for buildings, whilst for others concentrate on other incentives for the renovation. So at EU level, that's the difficulty, to find a one-size-fits-all for building energy performance standards, other than, of course, paying particular attention to these focus areas that I was mentioning. So really those worst performing areas of the building segment in each member state, in each region, because that is really a source of wasting energy that we need to tackle. And then really addressing those buildings where there are very win-win effects to be tapped, like for instance the one that I was mentioning for public buildings and for social infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Perhaps Louise, because as well Paula refers to the research done in your report, you could very briefly touch upon this, upon the answer that Paula gave and upon this question.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to, I think, violently agree with Paula that that the flexibility is key. What we found is that different target stocks or segments are targeted for different reasons. I can certainly see that in terms of political acceptability, perhaps starting with commercial buildings may be more politically acceptable than starting with homes, but certainly in some of the countries that have introduced that hasn't been the case. So I wouldn't say that that's the only place that we could start is commercial buildings. I would just say that I think, actually going back to Celine's question, I'm taking liberties here, but it is relevant to say that actually I think some of the biggest challenges we do have in joining up these sides of the coin, joining up the demand with the finance that we have coming available, are with the smaller projects. So we realise we've got large institutional funding through the EIB or other sources that is available for renovation projects, but that's a long way away from the individual, particularly home renovation level. And how do we get that money to these tiny projects? And I think the aggregators that we keep talking about, but I'm still not kind of quite sure how we bring those aggregators into being. I think that aggregation job will be massively helped by the guaranteed demand created by a minimum energy performance standard for that affects these smaller projects. So I think, once again, it depends, the flexibility in MEPs to target what we want to target. I do think that we shouldn't shy away from addressing some of the biggest challenges we have. And to my mind, some of the biggest challenges we have are driving the individual building, the largest number of those are homes, and how do we ensure that the demand for the finance meets the delivery of finance somewhere in the middle. And I think that's really helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. I think both your answers are reflected in the results of the poll as well, which will be published. Because actually what people, the audience finds the most important part of the comprehensive framework that should accompany the introduction of BEPS is the public subsidies. And the second one is the advisory service and one-stop shops. So I think the audience is really focusing on supporting building owners in getting things done within their buildings. Tjeerd, I see you have a quick comment as well on the results of the poll.
Yeah, just very briefly, because this is interesting, I think, to add. What we've also seen in the Netherlands, that once this financing is in place, it also has its limits, right? So even if financing is not an issue, it doesn't mean that all buildings will get renovated. So I see a very high score here on financial incentives, and I work for a bank, so I'm all for financial incentives. But I would like to draw attention to the fact that even if financing we have clear examples where the business case is extremely positive, right? On insulation or solar panels. It's an extremely positive business case, and financing is very much available. Still, owners of buildings can be reluctant because of many other reasons, like communications or the one-stop shop that was mentioned earlier, or best practices, or just accessibility to or availability of people that are actually doing this renovation. So I'm all for financial incentives. I work for a bank, so we are here to finance this renovation wave, and we are very keen to do it. And we are doing it for years already, but it is not it's not the holy grail of the renovation wave.
Yeah, we really need a comprehensive package to stimulate people to set the next steps in their renovation effort.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for that addition. I will give the floor back now to my colleague to round up this webinar. And from my side, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Bastian. Thank you very much. So I think it was a really fruitful debate. I noted down the 5 points that I took away from that. So hearing the discussions, I think that we can conclude that there is a right momentum right now for discussing energy performance standards for buildings at the EU level in the light of the Green Deal ambitions and ahead of the publication of the Renovation Wave strategy. Evidence clearly shows, we heard it from Louise and Tiat especially, that there are already examples, experience on the topic. And what is also clear to all of us is that there will be no climate neutrality without decarbonization of the building stock, and energy efficiency is the solution to make this progress. So we have the examples, and we can see that standards can be instrumental for a clear vision to make different segments of the building stock energy efficient and decarbonized. This needs to be complemented, as Bastian just said, by the total framework package, creating enabling framework, including one-stop shops, financial incentives. We need to find the magic, let's say, package that works. And it seems like what we discussed actually is that building energy performance standards can be complementary and actually support planning and effective implementation of the national long-term renovation strategies, which already demand trigger points, milestones, ensuring trajectories for renovating buildings, enabling finance, tackling the worst performing buildings, as Paula said. So I think we go to the right direction and we have something to work on. And what also popped up in the debate, I think is very timely, that we are now discussing the MFF and recovery plans, as Paula said. This gives an excellent opportunity to take action on renovation and perhaps to develop delivering the real performance of the building stock and innovation that Pernille insisted on to make European building stock this lab, this showroom for the technologies, top-class technologies that we have in Europe. I think it's an excellent point. And the final point, I think the discussion showed today that with all of that, we can lead to further fruitful exchanges in the next weeks, and the inclusion of building energy performance standards in the action plan and strategic communication of the renovation wave. And we can deliver on the promise on the comfortable, healthy, efficient homes for all Europeans that we all want. So thank you very much. I think this is all from our side. I'm looking forward to further exchanges. And thank you to our audience for amazing questions. I think we can also list them and look at them later on. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.